Hello and welcome to this video about endpoint assessment and the standards. So we all know now that the standards are in place and that anyone on an apprenticeship must do an endpoint assessment. We know that the endpoint assessment organisation needs to be independent from the training provider, so therefore if we've taught the teaching and learning, we are not allowed to endpoint assess. So what this means is we need to be able to have mechanisms in place to support the learner through that endpoint process. So it makes sense that early on in the learner journey we know who the endpoint organisation is going to be. This way we have an opportunity to look at their syllabus and look at some of their assessment methodology and synopsis around their endpoint process. It's important as teachers that we start preparing the learners as early on as we can in getting used to the concept of endpoint assessment. Meaning, if there's on-the-job training required or an on-programme training, that we kind of get them familiar to what they're going to see at the end. So therefore, maybe we set multiple choice tests throughout their teaching and learning. Provide opportunities for them to have professional discussions throughout their journey. Or, if the end method is assessed by a project, we prepare projects so they know how to write and prepare projects ready for the endpoint assessment. If we don't understand the endpoint assessment process, we can't possibly prepare our learners for it. So it's really important we go online and we read some of the information around it. Now, the Institute for Apprenticeships clearly write the assessment plans. And just because they deal with the endpoint assessment methodology does not mean that we don't have a responsibility to understand it. And ultimately, when we do curriculum design, we should be encompassing all of that throughout the journey, constantly testing and preparing. So let's just look at this for one moment. Some of the standards have on-programme qualifications, and what that generally means is the qualification that they're delivering through the on-programme of the standards generally links to the skills, knowledge and behaviours required to pass the endpoint test. And actually, by completing a combination of qualifications, you in essence have met the skills, knowledge and behaviours required. And there may be a requirement just to do a top-up sessions really, just to make sure that the skills, knowledge and behaviours required have been taught. Now, your endpoint assessment organisations will probably tell you this. They'll say, if you're doing, for example, health and social care, the on-programme and the care certificate, between those two, meet 95% of the standards. Meaning there's this much left to teach before the learner is ready to engage in the endpoint exam. On the grounds that the learner has progressed and achieved their certificates, we know that they're in a good place to sit the endpoint exam. However, there are some programs that no longer have on-programme programs. And what this means is we have to be able to demonstrate effective teaching, learning and progression towards the standards, where there is no more formal process of doing that. So what we've suggested is the delivery, the scheme of work, the delivery programme will obviously be sectioned off. Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, Section 4. And each session will be tracked as a progression towards a skill, a knowledge or a behaviour. So by completing this class session here, you would have completed this skill, this knowledge and this behaviour. And that would then track into the standard. And these programmes for the skills, knowledge and behaviours will have some formative assessments that then will create a micro portfolio for the endpoint of the standards. It's important that you sit down with your head subject expert to look at your programme of delivery and how that meets the standards. Now, 3 months before the end of the learner's journey, we should be arranging the gateway meeting. And the gateway meeting is a conversation between the training provider, the employer and the endpoint organisation. And the three of us coming up with a triangular approach to put the learner at the centre and say, do we agree that the learner has demonstrated sufficient knowledge and understanding to be put in for this endpoint test? Ideally, in the last 3 months of the standards, we'll go back and we'll start the revision. So a bit like GCSE prep, if you were. We'll be preparing them using the endpoint methods and using some of the mock assessment tools that the endpoint organisation may have produced to help you assess the learner. Remember that their endpoint assessment is going to be around the skills, the knowledge and behaviours identified in the Institute for Apprenticeships framework, and it is not going to be assessed against an on-programme delivery that they may have or may not have been taught. So it's important that you set time aside within your delivery to making sure that the standards are clearly identified and that you know when the endpoint assessment is coming up. And when you review progression, you are going to review progression against the standards if it is an apprenticeship that you're doing. So therefore it's really important that we look at the standards, and if there's an on-programme, how that links across, and if there's not an on-programme, how you are matching and proving the learner is progressing. So it makes sense, does it not, to produce a delivery plan and a scheme of work for maybe 34 weeks, which covers a year. Each session is a percentage towards the overall progression. At the end of each session, as long as the learner has passed your formative and summative assessments throughout that session, you're happy that they've achieved it, you can sign that bit off. And therefore, if the learner has missed any of those sessions, we have some sessions at the end that they can play catch up to pass. This way you'll have a structured way of delivery and a structured way of monitoring progression against the standards if there is no on-programme programme. I understand that this is new and for a lot of us can seem a daunting time. However, it is down to us to prepare and plan the learners for the standards, and therefore we need to be able to become more confident in the interpretations of those. So if you need more knowledge or understanding around the standards on how you are going to teach them and embed that into your normal everyday practice in class, then please make sure you speak to the teach and learn assessment teams. But it is absolutely down to the teacher who is delivering that subject matter to ensure that the learner has the right teaching and learning resources. Because if the programme hasn't got an on-programme qualification linked to it, it is going to be down to the delivery assessment team to make sure that the standards are being taught in line with the endpoint process. Hopefully that makes it a little bit easier and clearer for us to understand, and hopefully that gives an explanation about how you're going to monitor and track progression for the standards. Please leave your comments below, because obviously we want to be able to try and make this as clear as possible around delivering the standards, and we're aware that more work needs to be done in upskilling and supporting the teams. What I would say is we now as teachers have to evolve, and we have to evolve in a way where our resources become more 21st century, and that we use teaching styles that truly reach all parts of the community, and we make learning more interesting and inspiring, because no longer are we going to have the ability to test that. That's going to be a separate organisation, and we really want to make sure that our teaching and learning meets all the learning styles of learners, so we give them the best possible opportunity to pass that endpoint test. Thanks for watching.